Good morning, everyone. My name is Rodrigo Riaza, and I'm going to be your moderator for today. The executive director of the Colombian American Association has been having some technical issues, so I will do my best to fill in her shoes and introduce today's panel on Colombia's outlook, opportunities and challenges for 2021. I would like to thank on Lina's behalf also the AmCham Colombia and Ana Lucia Jaramillo, who is also with us today for being a partner in this event. And before we get to the conversation, I would also like to introduce our panel for today. We have joining us from Colombia, we have Angela Hurtado, who is a managing director for JP Morgan. We also have Stephen Donahue, who is a managing partner at McClarty Associates, and we have Richard Francis joining us from New York, who's a director at Fitch Ratings. So thank you all of you for joining us, and thank you for all of the attendees also who are with us today from probably around the continent. And we're just a bit of housekeeping before we begin. We will be having the opportunity to ask questions through the Q&A button that you see on the Zoom. It's going to be open during the entire conversation, and I will be reading your questions, and towards the end, I will be asking them on your behalf. So please feel free to send them along. So thank you again. And before we get started, I wanted to, make our first question a bit of a sentiment survey, a mini sentiment survey with our panelists. It's definitely been a bumpy start for 2021 around the world. Many of us expected a clean sheet and we didn't get one. So my first question really is taking into account, how Colombia has fared compared to some of its regional peers and around the world. How pessimistic and optimistic are you about the outlook for Colombia in 2021? And since you're in Colombia, Angela, I would like to start with you.
Okay, so I'm going to say quickly that I'm optimistic, realistic optimistic.
Stephen?
Well, I'm always optimistic about Colombia. Colombia is a great country with tremendous natural resources and also wonderfully talented human resources. So whatever comes along, Colombia has been able to work its way through issues, especially as compared to its peers. It's had tremendous challenges over the last decades and has been able to wade through them and succeed. So I'm very optimistic, especially given its peers in the region.
Richard?
I guess I'm somewhat in between. I think there's reason for optimism, cautious optimism, but after such a deep downturn, they have a long way to kind of get themselves out of the hole. I think Colombia, was kind of in the middle of the pack. Some countries are worse in terms of the economic fall. Panama, we're expecting nearly 16% fall, a huge fall. Double digits in Peru. And some countries did better, like Uruguay or, some other countries. So I think kind of Colombia is kind of in the middle, and we are expecting a rebound. We're looking at around a 5%. And, I do think there's some upside to that 5%. The fourth quarter numbers were quite strong, which gives a good base to grow into 2021. So you could be looking at, as high as 6% growth this year. So that's a reason alone to be optimistic. Obviously, there are a lot of challenges. We are seeing the second wave. We saw a pretty big spike in ICU beds being used in January in Bogota. And we're seeing lockdowns, but not as stringent as the lockdowns that we saw at the peak last year. So that's good news in terms of the economy. We'll have to see how that fares in terms of the coronavirus cases. And then, I guess Colombia is going to start getting vaccines and vaccinating its population February 20th, which is a little bit slower than some of the other countries in the region. But I guess that's to be expected. I think, just in general, it looks like emerging markets are probably going to get vaccines with a delay. And that probably means realistically, you're not going to see a significant portion of the population vaccinated until the second half of the year, probably. So that goes to some of the downsides, and we'll get into that, I guess.
Yes, we will. Angela, I would like to give the floor to you, see how your notes compare to Richard's in terms of the economic outlook.
No, I think that I agree that in terms of the region, Colombia is well positioned in 2021 for revamping the economy. I think that the fundamentals globally are also helping Colombia to have a strong case for 2021, even though I agree that the challenges are there, especially this year, where global conditions are going to continue to be supportive, but are going to be more selective. So I think that the countries are in a position where they need to choose how to guarantee the long-term growth. I think that 2021 for most of the countries globally are going to be a growth story. And I think that the important is how we are going to face for the years to come. But I think that Colombia has the elements to build a case of successful and to be in a better place than when we were in 2019.
Thank you. I know, as you say, the long-term story is of interest to a lot of the panelists, a lot of the attendees who are also investors or have operations in Colombia. And a key part of that is the fiscal outlook. You know, Colombia, like many other countries in the region, is stuck between a hard rock and a hard place, with still, you know, deep social needs for relief, but at the same time, with significant increases in the public debt to GDP ratio and increasing fears of fiscal risks. So Richard, you know, Colombia suspended the fiscal rule. We're still waiting for a new fiscal framework that was supposed to be published this week, but has been delayed. So would you give us your view on the fiscal outlook for 2021? And do you see the prospect for a return to fiscal sustainability in Colombia?
Sure. Well, I guess, you know, going into the pandemic, I think Colombia was on a relatively weak footing on the fiscal side. We actually had a negative outlook on Colombia with a higher rating, a BBB rating, mainly due to, you know, after the oil shock in 2016, Colombia lost a significant portion of revenues and the fiscal deficit widened and the debt burden was rising. And the government was having a pretty difficult time meeting the fiscal targets. The fiscal targets were changing and the debt to GDP was rising before the pandemic. You know, when the pandemic hit, it became very obvious that Colombia was going to be hit on two sides. One, you know, just the pandemic itself, the need to quarantine, the lockdowns, you know, the impact that was going to have on economic growth and on revenues. But secondly, Colombia was hit because of the sharp fall in the oil price, which also, you know, they depend still a significant amount for the revenues on oil. So the combination led us to actually downgrade Colombia to BBB-, which is the lowest in the investment grade category. And we maintained a negative outlook, mainly based on, you know, key risks that we saw. One, from the growth, you know, we knew there was going to be a downturn. The growth actually turned out worse than we expected. You know, we're looking at nearly a 7% fall last year. And, you know, unemployment reached over 20%. It's come down gradually, but still very high. And then on the second part was on the fiscal, you know, the deficit. We were expecting a high deficit. We were expecting them to suspend the fiscal rule realistically. But the deficit last year was over 9% of GDP, so quite a high deficit. And debt to GDP rose to, by the way we measure it, about 60%. It ended the year in 2019 at 45%. So it was a 15 percentage point increase in debt to GDP. So we reviewed the rating in November. We maintained the negative outlook. And, you know, the key thing that we're going to be looking at is the ability of the government to adjust on the fiscal side, to bring down the deficits and begin to stabilize the debt, but not just stabilize at this point. We actually want to see debt to GDP coming down. Debt to GDP across the region and in the BBB category rose for some similar reasons to Colombia. But in the case of the BBB median, which is the lowest rung of investment grade, the debt to GDP rose from about 42% to 52%. So there's a significant divergence between Colombia and the BBB median. So what are we looking for? We're looking at what the outlook is for growth. If there is going to be a rebound of 5%, if it's better than 5%, that's great, because growth helps all kinds of different dynamics. We're measuring debt to GDP, so the debt to GDP is higher. That's good, and also higher GDP tends to mean higher revenue, so that would be good for the fiscal. The second thing we're looking at is what the government's plan is in terms of a fiscal adjustment. The government itself says that it needs about 2 percentage point rise in revenues, and that implies a tax reform. And the government has indicated that it intends to submit a tax reform. We don't know what the details are, obviously, but we don't know how much they're going to be aiming for. But those two dynamics are key for us in terms of stabilizing or downgrading the rating. What happens to growth and what happens on the fiscal, and not just this year. Probably we're going to be more focused on 2022 going forward.
Thank you, Richard. You touched upon the revenue side of things, and I would like to turn to that, given some of the recent news that have been dominating part of the conversation in Colombia, the prospect for the privatization of ISA, the state-owned electricity company. So, Angela, I would like to turn to you. Generally speaking, how do you view the prospect of privatizations generally in terms of to plug the fiscal hole this year? And can you, for those observers of Colombia that are seeing the news that a state-controlled company, the Ecopetrol, the state oil company, is making an offer to buy another state-owned company, can you kind of translate what that means to the external observer who might not understand how those dynamics works? So I'll give it to you.
Yeah, sure. So I think that, as Richard was mentioning, the fiscal challenge that we have been facing for many years have been pressing the numbers for Colombia. I think that, of course, the growth for 2021, and in fact, we update the growth expectations for this year to 5.8%, which is, I think, a relatively good number. Of course, coming from a very bad 7.2% in 2020, give us the sense that it's very difficult to think that in 2021 we are going to solve all what happened during 2020. I think that the government has always had the privatization as a way to increase the revenues of the government. I think that different from last year is that in 2020 we saw an important usage of multilaterals as a way to fund the deficit, and I think that helps to not necessarily press the local tests, the local government bonds, but at the same time, the government didn't need to use the privatization that normally is a very complex process. I think that for many years, the government is not the first year that the government has announced their intention to make a privatization. So I think that we need to still wait for a couple of weeks, probably months. As you mentioned, Rodrigo, they are planning to wait for a couple of weeks, probably until March, to have the reality of the fiscal plan, to understand and to see how the government is going to look for ways to privatization. I think that, of course, ISA has been there for as a one of the alternatives. Of course, the other alternative has been the equity offering of Ecopetrol that has been always there for years. So I think that the government and in general needs to see what is doable. I think that when we are very close to start a political process in the second half of this year, is always something to take into account. So I think that for many firms, for the reform that they are willing to pass, for any initiatives that they want to look in any type of privatization, the first half of the year is crucial. Probably if that doesn't necessarily happen that quickly, in the second half is going to be much more challenging. So for me, it's not necessarily a new news, because I mean the government has been open and looking for alternatives on the privatization side. I think that of course is always challenging in many forms, from the process, from the different political regulation, political regulation, everything that is linked to those type of process, I think is still a challenge. So that's why I think that they are waiting to have that information in order to also understand what type of reform they are looking for. You were mentioning, Richard, that probably the government has already mentioned between 1% or 2%. 2%, I think that it will be a very good number for a fiscal reform. My sense is that something between 1% plus a commitment in the long term, with a percentage of debt to GDP, to make sure that the burden in terms of the debt is not necessarily going to continue, but is going to be under control in the next couple of years. I think that that's something that can generate a little bit more of momentum. And I'm constructive also because I think that in terms of, we have to remember two things. The first one is that the government is using the IMF line, that I think that is going to help. It helped in 2020. Probably part of that, when the Marco Fiscal is going to be published, is going to probably also be used in part in 2021. Second, I think that when we look the alternative for the fiscal reform, that I think is going to be crucial, not just for the fiscal revenues, but also for the growth perspective, that is what matters in the long term, is going to be very important to have probably some focus on BIT, some focus on the increase of the base for natural people that is going to pay rent. So I think if the government is able to focus in those two matters, I think that with the experience of 2020, when we saw that the possibility to return money back to the poor population, it's a way to compensate. I think that we can have a strong argument to go to look for an increase in the base of the BIT, and guarantee that that is not necessarily going to be regressive and is going to have more support. So I think that privatization is just one part of the equation. It has been there, can continue be this year the case, but I think that still we need information and days, probably weeks to come. No.
Thank you, Angela. Stephen, I would like to turn to you on kind of in that same line. You're in touch with a lot of American companies, especially that are looking to invest or have operations in Colombia. What kind of opportunities in terms of foreign investment are you seeing in this environment that was just laid out? And what is your message to those companies in terms of the kind of the fiscal risks that Angela and Richard have also and the economic outlook that they've laid out?
Well, thanks. I would start by saying that fortunately, Colombia has a long history of stability in its leadership in the economic and financial sphere. So having people like the current finance minister, who is tremendously skilled and talented and experienced, pulling the levers, especially at a difficult time like right now with COVID, gives you some security that nothing silly, nothing off the wall is going to happen, that the decisions that are made are based on facts and trying to do the best in a difficult situation. With respect to U.S. companies investing, of course, the opportunities that are presented by privatization are ones that are very, very interesting. And given the stability over time that Colombia has present a real opportunity for folks to look at, especially if they're trying to balance their portfolio and want to include part of their portfolio in Latin America, where when you look around the region, the options aren't that great in Colombia, certainly compared to other countries in South America, Mexico these days, Brazil clearly are the first among equals. But if you look at their situation, it's just very difficult to make a decision in that direction. And so Colombia, Peru are ones where there are real opportunities. Ecuador, maybe to some extent, if the politics play out next week. So I think Colombia's in good shape, and for companies that are thinking about investing, it's like anywhere else. You have to do a very careful due diligence and understand what the rules of the game are. Colombia's bureaucracy isn't always as accommodating as it might be, but I think that part of that has to do with the fact that in Colombia, a law degree is an undergraduate degree, and so they tend to be a very litigious group of people that where you end up fighting over things that in other environments might be handled quite easily.
Thank you, Stephen. I would like to kind of turn forward towards the rest of the reform agenda that has also been kind of discussed and has also been in the pipeline, as you say, Angela, for a long time. We touched upon the fiscal reform, but there's also been discussions surrounding pension reform, labor flexibility, a series of productivity enhancing reforms that are aimed at boosting growth, but also creating some additional fiscal space. So I would like to open the floor on that topic. Let's start with you, Richard. What is your view on that reform agenda?
Well, I mean, clearly, the number one reform that we're focusing on is the possible tax reform. Kind of for the reasons that I stated, just the debt to GDP rising so much, and the expectation that they need to do a fiscal adjustment. But clearly, before the pandemic, there were two basic big reforms that the government was talking about. One was the labor reform, and the other is the pension reform that you mentioned. Labor reform, to flexibilize the labor market, reduce some of the costs associated, kind of non-wage costs associated to businesses, these type of things could make the labor market more flexible and more dynamic, and make Colombia in general more competitive. I think Colombia historically has had a kind of structurally high unemployment rate, and some of these issues could be tackled in a labor reform. And by doing that, by making Colombia more competitive and reducing the unemployment rate, that could conceivably boost kind of medium-term growth prospects. So I think net it would be positive. Obviously, these types of changes are hard politically, but I think with unemployment rising so much, I think the government during the pandemic did do some temporary measures to flexibilize the labor market. Politically speaking, it might be a good time to try to push that reform. We'll see. On the pension reform, the problem in Colombia, as with much of Latin America, is very low coverage ratios. I think 25% of the population somehow in the pension system. And then, as with the rest of the region as well, the replacement rates are quite low. So people are saying that they want, for obvious reasons, want a higher pension when they retire. So those are two of the key elements. I think one that has a fiscal impact on, and then the thing that we'd be more focused on is on the fiscal impact. And on the fiscal, right now there's a private, the AFPs, the private pension funds, and then there's the Colpensiones and some local and regional government public funds, and they kind of compete with each other. And in Colombia, unlike a lot of countries, you can switch from one to the other. And so there's some temptation, especially for higher income people, to switch from the private system to the public system to get a higher pension. And that, in the short run is actually good for the fiscal accounts, because when people switch from the private to the public, they bring all of the assets they've accumulated in the private funds to the public fund. But because the public fund is more generous, that implies higher costs to the government over the medium and long term. So it's actually quite negative. So one of the things that has been talked about is not allowing people to switch from one to the other, especially because it's regressive. The people who benefit the most are actually the higher income people. But that actually would entail a fiscal cost in the front and the short term, because people are not going to be transferring their money over. In the longer term, it's beneficial. So there's this issue on the fiscal side with the pension accounts. But the overall theme in terms of the pension reform is to make it more equitable and to expand the coverage and to increase the replacement rates, which is obviously a good thing from a political and social point of view, obviously. So it's a bit complicated, and I think for us, the pension reform of those three reforms is probably not as important, because it could have a negative impact in the short term on the fiscal, in the longer term beneficial. But I think to do three big reforms in 1 year, politically speaking, is going to be quite challenging. So clearly for us, it's tax, and then the labor would be good, and then pension. We'll see. We'll see if they attempt to do all three. We'll see, but it might be for the next government.
Angela, I want to turn it over to you on that, but just before going over, just to remind the audience that the Q&A is open. You can send in your questions through a Q&A button that's on the bottom of your screen, and we'll be asking them in about 15 minutes. So Angela, over to you.
Yeah, sure. Oh, thank you. I think that the reform that the government knows and understands needs to pass, of course, are the three that Richard mentioned. I feel that at some point, I'm coming from a think tank that I understand is going to propose like a Desarrollo that is willing to propose like integrate the three reforms in one. I think that can be a little bit challenging, but I think that makes sense. Why? Because as you mentioned, Richard, the discussion around the pension reforms is going to have fiscal impact. Any type of flexibilization on the labor market also can have a sort of impact on the fiscal numbers. So I think that everything is a little bit more related now than before. I think that we need, as population in Colombia, we need to understand that the reforms are required. Yesterday, I was listening to the news that, of course, every union said no reform, but I think that we need to open what type of reform are we looking for. I think that the discussion, when you open the discussion about the minimum rent that we want to guarantee to certain population, when we want to not necessarily flexibilize the labor market, but probably become that the reality is I mean, regulation needs to understand that the market had changed and needs to move to that way. We cannot change the labor market. We cannot change what the trends are going to be in terms of digitalization. We need to understand that the regulation needs to move forward. And there is quite important the type of commitment that the different parties, different interest groups are willing to add to the reform. It would be great to have some integrated reform. I think that it would be a good opportunity to get that. I understand that there is some interest on the government trying to pass a combination of the fiscal and the social reform, trying to bring some of the points that probably going into the details in a deep pension reform or in a deep labor reform is going to be difficult. But I think that if we are able through that more integrated reform, bring the most important points into the discussion, maybe we can move forward and hopefully have a good news. No, of course, the discussions are always difficult, but I think that if there is a moment where we can bring different parties to have an open discussion about this and probably socialize a more integrated reform is now.
Thank you, Angela. That was a very comprehensive view. I want to shift gears a little bit and turn to you, Stephen, and really, I would love to get your view on the future of the U.S.-Colombia relationship moving forward. Biden is now president, Duque is still president, and there were a lot of issues that were already building up before Biden took office, and there are going to be new priorities moving forward. So can you lay those out? What do you think the tone of the relationship is going to be, some of the opportunities and the priorities that are going to exist, but also some of the pain points that are going to come up?
Well, I'd start by saying that the U.S. and Colombia have a long history of being allies through thick and thin, going back at least to, I guess, World War II and the Korean War. So there's the ability to weather storms that come up pretty well. Most of the time, the countries have been able to work together pretty well. Colombia and the Colombian government and Colombian members of the Congress have had some missteps in the last year that have caused some anxiety on the part of the incoming administration and their team. But I think we've seen a clear signal that they're ready to put that beyond them. And I think President Biden knows Colombia well. I worked with him when he was in the Judiciary Committee years ago when Plan Colombia was being formulated. He knows the region. He cares about the region, and I think he will find ways to work together with Colombia because of Colombia's importance to the U.S. and clearly the U.S.'s importance to Colombia. We have a great friendship and relationship. I think we just saw in the last hour the naming of the new Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere, who is an experienced career diplomat who has served in Colombia at the U.S. Embassy. The current senior advisor at the White House's National Security Council, Juan Gonzalez, is a former Colombian himself who has great experience in Colombia and understands the region well. And I think we have a tremendous ambassador at the U.S. Embassy in Colombia, and his team are all very experienced Colombia hands that served in Colombia repeatedly. They understand the issues, they understand the challenges, and they want to work with the government of Colombia to find ways where our interests are mutual and work on those and try to work around those issues that where we have differences of opinion. I think the challenge that the Duque administration has is to try to move forward in an agenda that is good for the country, but doesn't step on some of the issues that they face at home. Colombia continues to have serious problems with inequity. The street demonstrations we saw last year were an expression of frustration and dissatisfaction, perhaps fueled by some folks that were trying to create problems for the administration. But Colombia's still got a positive outlook, in my view, and has been fairly skilled in being able to handle the situation. It faced skillful politicians. I think there was Colombia suffered a great loss with the death of Carlos Holmes Trujillo. That left a hole. The replacement Minister of Defense that was named this morning is talented, doesn't have a whole lot of experience in security or intelligence matters, but will come up to speed quickly enough, and he's got an experienced team working for him. So I think there will be some more personnel changes in Colombia that try to fit the new leadership in the United States, and I look forward to a strong, growing relationship. Colombia is important to the U.S. For a lot of reasons, including its regional position with the issues in neighboring countries. And I think the U.S. wants to find ways to work with the Colombian government and the Colombian people to continue to have that close partnership.
Thank you, Stephen. And just to kind of follow up on that, are there any issues in particular that you have your eyes set on? One that has, for example, a lot of domestic repercussions is the peace deal, as it is a polarizing political force in Colombia.
Well, I think on that one, I just say, you know, the announcement that the HEP came out with last week was a tremendous move forward. There are a lot of Colombians and Americans that didn't believe that the peace deal was working, in part because that structure that was created had not shown any results. And now we've got real results that we'll have to see how the FARC leadership responds to it and whether they accept their culpability. But I thought that was a tremendous move forward, and hope that that will be just the first of many steps to go forward. On the other hand, you saw the article on the front page article of Semana this week, where the ELN has had a tremendous growth and influence throughout the region, not just Colombia, which is a cause for concern. Colombia has to face up to that and work collaboratively with other countries to confront the challenges of violence that have plagued the country. And then lastly, the drug issue is one you just can't ignore. The U.S. carefully monitors the coca production in Colombia, which has at best stayed level. And the issue of whether or not Colombia allows the spraying of glyphosate on the coca fields is one that's going to be fundamental to being able to move forward. And that, whether we like it or not, is one of the measuring sticks by which U.S. policymakers, both in the administration and in the Congress, measure whether the Colombia is cooperating on the drug issue. So those are fundamental issues that are always in the conversation, but it's a conversation among friends. But they're challenges that are tough challenges.
Thank you, Steven. Indeed, it's still early in the new administration, but I'm sure we're gonna get more details very soon. I'd like to, there's been some questions that have been coming in, so I wanna give way to one of them. And basically, it's about the outlook for the manufacturing sector in Colombia. It was one of the first ones to be opened up, let's say, after the lockdown last year. And we saw a big rebound, but we've seen lately kind of a slowdown in manufacturing, industrial production at the end of 2020. So I'd like to bring that up to the panel. Maybe Angela, do you want to take this one?
Yes, I think that manufacturing in Colombia this year should continue with the trend that we saw at the end of 2020. Constructive thinking that the problems related with the demand because of the lockdowns are going to be very focused in January, and probably the correlation between those lockdowns and the impact on the economy, not just in Colombia but in general globally, has been reducing dramatically since the beginning of the COVID. So I think that probably for February and the rest of the year, we are going to continue to see a recovery on industrial production. Probably the recovery is going to be more focused, instead of on industrial production, more on the consumer part of the economy. I think that consumption can be a good driver for what can happen, and probably the services are going to continue driving the demand on the economy. But I think that the manufacturer, it's coming from a very low base. So just because of the base effect that we are going to have this year is going to be a good year. But we think that this can continue even in 2022. In fact, we also increased part of the forecast for 2022. There is another component that is very important for Colombia. That is that given all the good fundamentals that we are seeing globally, we also update the forecast for oil for 2021 to $65 the WTI, which is good for Colombia. I think that the chain of that and the general impact that the oil has in Colombia is important, especially in many fronts, not just on the fiscal side, also in terms of the current account deficit, also in terms of the demand and the other sectors that helps to help in terms of dynamics. So we are constructive thinking that the manufacturing and industrial production can have a good 2021, Rodrigo.
Thank you. I don't know if Richard or Stephen, do you want to jump in on this?
I would just say that Colombia has an opportunity on manufacturing with the nearshoring that is coming out of Asia. And fortunately, Colombia has a very talented commerce minister and the ProColombia group that is actively pursuing those opportunities and creating a good environment for companies who have currently manufacturing in Asia to look at Colombia as an option. Mexico is not as attractive as it used to be under the current situation, and the centrals are not quite up to speed with the different challenges they have. So Colombia, with its ports on both oceans and the talent and skilled labor that exists, despite some of the problems, the labor issues that Richard talked about earlier, presents an opportunity for nearshoring of manufacturing to feed both Europe and the United States.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Stephen.
just very briefly, I think the first 3 quarters last year, the manufacturing fell over 11%, so pretty sharp fall. That was probably just mainly the lockdowns and people not able to go to work. So I agree with Angela that that we should see a pretty big rebound and just from the base effect alone. So I think in that sector should do relatively well. And I agree also that the type of quarantines and lockdowns are going to be more focused, and probably therefore it's not going to have as big an impact in certain sectors, and manufacturing is one of them. I mean, certain sectors will continue to suffer, like hotels and restaurants, but certain sectors like manufacturing should rebound pretty strongly.
It seems there's a lot of interest from the audience to dig deeper, to kind of go back to the reform discussion and dig a little deeper into what specific components need to be, especially in the fiscal and the labor reforms. So I kind of wanted to bring that back to you. We talked generally about the options for passage, merging some of the reforms, but can you dig a little deeper into what some of the specific measures that would be in those reforms? And I think it would be very useful since, especially for the fiscal reform, this is still very recent since the last one. There were already some proposals that I'm sure you're going to mention that were discussed last time that didn't get through due to enormous social backlash. So it would also be useful, I think, if you kind of gauge which ones you think are more realistic in terms of passing, and which ones you think are needed, of course. So maybe Angela.
Yes, sure. I think that I'm going to think what are probably the crucial parts of each reform. On the fiscal side, I already mentioned, I think that the VAT is one of the main holes that the system has. And I remember that in the last tax reform, one of the concerns that opposition had with the proposal to increase the VAT for other products was precisely that the proposal of the government was, I'm going to increase the base for the VAT, but at the same time, I'm going to guarantee the return for the population. So that way, the percentage of usage of the new reform is going to be progressive and is not going to be regressive as normally happens with a tax as the VAT. I think that in 2020, the way that the government sent the social impulse to too many families around Colombia was an opportunity to show that he's able, in terms of logistics, to put on place a program to return the resources to the population that is more vulnerable. So I think that if the government is able to, even if they are just focused on that part, increasing the VAT for many products and probably a general rate that it probably is not necessarily being able to be 19%, maybe can be lower, but going to the full population of products and making sure that there is a specific program to return the money to the population, I think that is a win for the reform. In the labor, I think that is just understanding and making sure that all the unions and all the people that is willing not to pass any change in the labor reform is affecting not their jobs, but it's affecting the rest of the population. So I think that, of course, is making sure that companies, when we think the 80% of the companies in Colombia has less than 6 people. So it means that when we are thinking about unions, when we are thinking about big social movements, are not necessarily focused on the most of the companies in Colombia. So most of those companies are not necessarily formal because they don't necessarily have the tools to do it. It's too difficult to understand. And given the digitalization, the changes, the technology, how many of the people is looking to work right now, what happened is that people doesn't receive any type of protection because there is not the realization that the labor market has changed. So if we are able to change and being able to quote in hours or in days, I think that that is the big change. In the pension reform, I think that the discussion it has to be around if we as a country need to keep the link between the pension and the labor, no? And I think that is why it's so important to discuss that at this moment. Should we dislink that the pension is just for people that work, or maybe we can think in an alternative that allows all people in Colombia to have like a minimum rent at some point, but also with the commitment that we are going to have a system that is much more efficient, a system that probably is not generating the type of distortion that is generating right now, where most of the subsidies are concentrated in rich people and not in the people that is vulnerable. I think that if we are able to concentrate the discussion, the integrated discussion in this part, I think that it's something that people need to probably link between one reform and the other, and probably help them to understand that. I'm normally very, very curious about people that goes to the streets, and especially young people that go to the streets against labor reform, against pension reforms, when they don't understand the system, that of course is very complicated, but they don't understand that if we don't change the systems, probably they are the population that is going to be more affected in the next 10 years. So I think that the part of education, how to show this to the people to support the reform, is key in order to pass it.
Richard, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think she touched upon the key areas. Obviously, on the fiscal reform, you know, I think as you mentioned in the financing law that was passed in 2018, the original proposal was both to expand the base on the VAT and to kind of reduce, you know, corporate tax rates and give some incentives for investment and things like that. Politically speaking, expanding the base of the VAT was very unpopular and controversial, and ultimately that failed in the Congress, and the reform therefore was actually revenue negative instead of positive, because it gave all the positive, the tax cuts and the incentives, but it didn't raise any taxes on at least in the medium term, because it didn't include the VAT. I think, as Angela mentioned, politically speaking, I think it's a little bit more palatable now because the government has created a way to return the VAT to the poorest segment of the population, in some kind of rebate. And because of that, I think now, politically speaking, it might be more palatable because you can actually expand the base, but somehow still give some of these rebates to the poorest segment of the population, and therefore it's not regressive, as Angela said. So I think maybe that it might be able to go forward. For us, we don't care what reform they do ultimately. What we care about is the revenue take that the government gets, because the fiscal deficit is so wide. They need to bring down the deficit. The spending is quite inflexible. So realistically speaking and structurally speaking, the most obvious way to have a fiscal adjustment is to increase revenues, and the easiest tax to collect is the VAT. So that would be, that will be one area that we'll be looking at if they're able to do it or not. But whether they touch corporate rates and say we're not going to keep on cutting them, or we're going to get rid of the incentives, or we're going to increase personal income taxes, or we're going to increase sin taxes on alcohol and tobacco. It doesn't matter to us. What really matters is the fiscal impact ultimately. There are a lot of it's complicated talking about the labor reform, but I think obviously, I think I mentioned before, that could be positive for economic growth, help flexibilize the market, allow for more contract workers, part-time workers, reduce some of the non-wage costs, like health clubs and things like that businesses have to, or are forced to do by law. If they were able to reduce some of those costs, we're not talking wages here, we're talking about other benefits, and create a more flexible labor market overall. That could help employment, help reduce unemployment, and ultimately help growth. So, those would be two areas that could be good, for Colombia in general.
Thank you, Richard. We're coming towards the end, so I want to ask all the panelists a forward-looking question. Obviously, we're all very focused on the pandemic right now. We're all focused on 2021, but coming just around the corner in 2022 is a presidential election. And as we've discussed, there's a lot of political tensions. There's a lot of delicate reforms that need to happen. And there's still a lot of social discontent that was there even before the pandemic hit, as we saw in the massive protests that happened in late 2019. So the question is really basic, but how worried are you about the 2022 elections? Obviously taking the 2018 election as a reference, with the rise of a potentially populist candidate from the right or from the left. So Stephen, do you want to take us up?
Well, I'm always concerned about when you come up to elections, when you see some of the players that Colombia has that have been active politically and even had some popularity. It's a concern that somebody that has a completely different way of thinking about the economic and social model might become president, and so that's a concern. On the other hand, Colombia has elected talented people, many talented young people in recent decades that have taken the country and moved it forward and managed the challenges of inequity that exists in a country where the rural areas get short shrift and have traditionally. So I think there are opportunities here, and you've got a huge pool of very talented people who may run for president. And I think that in almost every case, the kind of people that are thinking about running are people that will do well for Colombia and for Colombia's placement in the regional scheme with other countries. Colombia has fortunately some very, very talented people, very well educated, and people who have tremendous experience, both men and women, who could easily fill the job as president of Colombia going forward. If you want me to predict, I won't tell you what her name is, but I think she'd be great as president.
Okay. Richard.
Yeah, I mean, I think generally Colombia tends to be fairly kind of moderate to conservative, just given their own history with the FARC and the ELN, still. And I think also there's an extra rationale given what's happening in their neighbor in Venezuela. People look at that and they're kind of like, oh, we see the disaster that Venezuela is. So I tend to think that, yeah, you could get a leftist, but it'll be a moderate leftist, like the mayor of Bogota, which would not, necessarily, it'd probably it'd be fine. There's no issues. They wouldn't completely change the model, as Stephen was saying. So it's really early, obviously. We're still over a year away from congressional elections that are in March, and then presidential, and over a year is an eternity in politics. So we have no idea. But I think, probably assuming that the economy picks up this year and it continues into next year, that unemployment continues to go down, that will probably give a good base for not completely moving away from the model that served Colombia quite well. And I think secondly, you do have congressional elections in March of next year, and it's very unlikely that you'll have a majority or even a big minority that will be any kind of extreme left. So I think that will act as a check and balance as well. So I think the risks are obviously when you have such deep scarring, that you have closure of businesses, that you have high unemployment, employment continues to be strong, high, and then you have kind of the backdrop of the social protests that we were seeing at the end of 2019. These type of things can put the model at risk. But I think that is probably going to diminish over time, assuming that the economy does pick up as we're expecting and continues into 2022. So cautiously optimistic that things will continue as we've seen in the past 50 years. So.
Thank you, Richard. Angela, do you want to close us off?
Yeah, I think that we normally are very worried about the political environment when the elections are coming. I feel that given how populism is contaminated both the extreme left and the extreme right, the fear is not necessarily being there. And I agree with Stephen and with Richard that Colombia has normally been more conservative on the type of election that does. I think that my main concern is not without any specific side, not necessarily picking a good manager. I think that now our country is what requires a good manager, and making sure that the decisions are taken, thinking in the not just on the social, but also on the economic. It has to be much more integrated. I think that the level of polarization that we have had in the last 10 years around the peace deal or no peace deal has contaminated most of the discussion. And I think that the focus on what we are discussing right now are much more challenging than just that. So for me, is making sure that we have a good candidate. It doesn't matter the bias to the left or to the right, but a good manager that is able to deliver and to generate more consensus, to generate more union in the country, because I think that's the only way that we can pass certain types of reforms that are crucial. No? So always worried, but I think that hopefully we can see any good name at some point.
Thank you, Angela. So thank you to all the panelists, and I want to give the floor to Ana Lucia from AmCham Colombia for closing remarks. Is she there?
Yeah, I'm here. First of all, I just want to say that I'm the manager of AmCham Colombia's Southwest chapter, not of all Colombia. And first of all, I would like to thank all our panelists. It's been a very interesting discussion about what Colombia has to do during this year and a couple of coming years. I see more optimism than a pessimistic point of view about the future of Colombia, and that's very good for us. But it is a very important issue that is coming from the last couple of years, that the tax reform. Right now, it's not only tax reform, but also the labor and pension reform. You guys talk about different point of view. We should do it together, or do tax reform this year and make the other reforms next year. It is a very important issue for us, and also what's going to happen with the elections is also a very big driver of the economy in Colombia. So, well, I think you guys made a very good presentation of these issues, and again, thank you very much for being with us, and thanks to all the attendees that we have together.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rodrigo, Stephen,
Thank you
Richard,
all.
Ana Lucia, all.
You want to say something else?
No, just thank you so much for the opportunity to moderate this panel.
We're just in time.
Yes, I think that we're out of time. Thanks
Richard,
so much,
Stephen,
everyone.
Angela, thank you so much.
Thank you.